Picture this. You're a Saxon warrior in 865. After Christ, standing outside the ancient Roman walls of York on a crisp autumn morning. The mist is rolling off the Ouse River, and you can feel that familiar pre-battle tension in your gut. You've done this before. You know how sieges work. Your grandfather fought at these same walls. Your father taught you the old ways, and you've personally seen timber fortifications crumble under good Saxon iron and determination. But this morning, something's different. Behind those crumbling Roman stones, something impossible has risen overnight. A massive wooden fortress unlike anything in Saxon memory, and you're about to discover that everything you thought you knew about warfare is about to become as obsolete as bronze weapons in an iron age. The great heathen army had arrived, but they hadn't just brought warriors. They'd brought something far more dangerous. Master builders who were about to revolutionize British warfare forever. Now, to understand what the Saxons were seeing, you have to appreciate what they expected. Traditional Saxon siege warfare was brutal but predictable. You built your battering rams, you charged the walls, you exploited the corners where two wall sections met. Those were always the weakest points. You'd done it 100 times. Sometimes you won, sometimes you lost, but the rules never changed. Except the Vikings had thrown out the rulebook entirely. The first Saxon battering ram charged forward that morning with the usual war cries, the usual confidence. Imagine the sound, dozens of men running in formation, their ram made from the trunk of an ancient oak tree, iron-capped and heavy enough to punch through any wooden gate they'd ever encountered. And then, nothing. The ram hit those Viking walls, and something incredible happened. The walls bent. They actually bent like living muscle, absorbing the impact and springing back. The Saxon warriors must have stood there in stunned silence, watching their most trusted weapon bounce off timber walls that moved like they were alive. Because, in a sense, they were. What the Vikings had created was revolutionary. Instead of rigid wooden walls that would shatter under impact, they'd developed interwoven oak timbers that distributed force across the entire structure. Think of it like the difference between a rigid board that snaps under pressure and a woven basket that flexes and holds. The Viking fortress builders had essentially turned their walls into massive shock absorbers. But that was just the beginning of Saxon surprises that day. The gates. Oh, the gates were diabolical. Where Saxon fortresses typically had a single entrance that you could rush if you were brave enough and fast enough, these Viking gates featured triple killing zones. You'd break through the first barrier only to find yourself trapped in a narrow corridor where defenders above could rain down death from 3 different angles. It was like walking into a carefully engineered slaughterhouse. And then there were the walls themselves. Saxon fortresses had corners. Strong corners, supposedly. But corners create blind spots, and Saxon siege techniques had evolved to exploit those weaknesses. The Vikings had eliminated corners entirely. Their fortresses were circular, curved walls that provided defenders with sight lines in every direction and eliminated the weak points that Saxon tactics depended on. As the morning wore on and Saxon assault after Saxon assault failed against these alien defenses, something even more disturbing became clear. This wasn't just a fortress, it was a complete community. Inside those impossible walls, a new world was taking shape. Viking engineers like Ulf the Planner, and yes, they actually had engineers with titles like that, were working alongside captured Saxon craftsmen. Think about that for a moment. Bitter enemies forced to share knowledge, creating innovations that neither culture could have achieved alone. The Vikings weren't just conquering territory, they were absorbing and transforming the very knowledge of the people they defeated. Saxon spies who managed to infiltrate these strongholds returned with tales that sounded like fantasy. Underground tunnels that allowed defenders to appear behind besieging armies. Imagine attacking a fortress only to have armed warriors emerge from the ground behind you. Acoustic chambers designed to amplify sound, making 100 defenders sound like 1,000. Psychological warfare, engineered into the very architecture. But perhaps most disturbing to Saxon military thinking was where these fortresses were being built. Traditional wisdom said you built on high ground, on solid foundations, in places that were naturally defensible. The Vikings were building in marshy areas where Saxon cavalry would bog down, on river bends that provided water sources and escape routes, even on hilltops that previous military thought had deemed too exposed to defend effectively. They were rewriting the fundamental principles of defensive warfare. The fortress outside York featured modular wall sections. Think of it like military Lego blocks. Damaged sections could be rapidly repaired or entirely replaced. Walls could be expanded overnight. The whole structure could adapt and evolve faster than besieging forces could adjust their tactics. And here's where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. Inside these fortresses, Viking families were settling down. Norse children were playing in the shadows of weapon-sharp palisades, while their mothers traded with Saxon merchants who had accepted Viking protection. Markets were operating, communities were forming, and a hybrid culture was emerging that would transform both peoples forever. By the end of that first day outside York, Saxon commanders faced a terrifying realization. They weren't just fighting an army, they were confronting a completely new form of civilization, one that could build the impossible and make it work. The autumn mist that had started the day was lifting, but for Saxon military dominance, a much longer darkness was beginning to fall. Because what they'd witnessed wasn't just innovative engineering, it was the birth of a new kind of warfare that would reshape the very landscape of Britain. And the most frightening part, this was just the beginning. Because while Saxon warriors were still trying to understand what they'd seen outside York, Viking fortress builders were already planning something even more ambitious, a network of interconnected strongholds that would control not just battlefields, but entire kingdoms. The age of the fortress empire was about to begin. By 870 after Christ, something unprecedented was happening in the heart of England. The Vikings had evolved from raiders into empire builders, and their weapon of choice wasn't the longship anymore. It was the fortress. But not just any fortresses. They were creating something that would dominate English politics for generations, the legendary five boroughs system. Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Stamford, Lincoln. Say those names today and you're talking about pleasant English market towns. But in 870, you were naming the components of the most sophisticated military network medieval Europe had ever seen. 5 fortress cities positioned with mathematical precision, each exactly one day's march from its neighbours, creating a web of mutual support that Saxon armies simply couldn't break. The mastermind behind this network was Jarl Guthrum, the far-sighted, and his nickname wasn't just clever branding. This man understood something that would make modern military strategists nod in appreciation. Controlling space means controlling commerce, and his fortresses sat astride every major trade route in Middle England like toll booths backed by 1,000 swords. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. Within these wooden walls, something unprecedented was emerging, a hybrid society that nobody had planned, nobody had expected, and nobody could have imagined. Picture walking into Leicester in 875. You'd hear Saxon merchants haggling in broken Norse while paying taxes to Viking lords. You'd see Norse warriors married to English women, their children growing up speaking both languages fluently. You'd witness the birth of Anglo-Scandinavian culture that would reshape Britain in ways that pure military conquest never could have achieved. The construction of these fortresses followed methods that left Saxon observers slack-jawed with amazement. Remember, the Vikings were shipbuilders first, and they brought those skills to land-based construction. They used prefabricated sections created by Norse shipwrights. Imagine military construction using techniques borrowed from the maritime industry. What took Saxon builders months to construct, Vikings completed in weeks. The secret was modular construction. Master builder Thorkel Ironhand, IND Ace. And again, these weren't just random warriors with hammers. These were specialists with reputations, pioneered techniques that sound almost modern. He used living trees as corner posts, their roots providing immediate stability while their continued growth actually strengthened the fortification over time. It was engineering that worked with nature instead of fighting against it. Inside each fortress, you'd find carefully planned districts that would make a modern urban planner weep with envy. Weapon smithies, where Saxon iron-working techniques met Viking steel-making knowledge, creating alloys stronger than either culture had produced alone. Market squares using standardized Norse weights and measures, bringing consistency to trade across hundreds of miles. Communal halls, where Thing meetings introduced democratic governance to lands that had known only autocratic rule. The water systems, alone, were masterpieces of engineering. Clay-lined channels collected every drop of rainwater, making siege by thirst nearly impossible. Hidden food stores could sustain thousands for months, but it wasn't just about survival. These fortresses were designed for comfort, for permanent settlement, for the long game of cultural transformation. And the human stories, they're what really bring this period to life. Saxon noblewomen who married Viking jarls became powerful cultural bridges. They taught Norse settlers English agricultural techniques while learning Scandinavian textile production that would revolutionize British clothing. Monastery-trained Saxon scribes found themselves recording Viking law codes, creating the first written records of oral traditions that had governed Norse society for centuries. By 890, something remarkable had happened. The fortress communities had developed their own identity, neither purely Saxon nor Viking, but something entirely new. They spoke a Creole language that mixed Old English and Old Norse. They worshipped in churches decorated with Thor's hammers alongside Christian crosses. They defended walls their grandfathers had died trying to breach. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect was economic. These fortresses weren't just military installations draining resources from the countryside. They were economic engines. The security they provided encouraged trade, their standardized systems reduced transaction costs, and their hybrid populations created new markets for goods and services. A Saxon farmer could sell grain to Viking warriors who paid in silver, earned from trade routes that stretched from Ireland to Constantinople. A Norse craftsman could create jewelry using Saxon techniques for English customers who appreciated Scandinavian designs. The fortresses had become economic multipliers, generating wealth instead of just consuming it. The defensive innovations kept evolving too. Viking builders developed false walls that created trap corridors. Imagine breaking through what you think is the main defense, only to find yourself in a killing box with the real fortification still ahead of you. Collapsible bridges could isolate sections under attack, turning a single fortress into multiple independent strongholds. Tower designs began incorporating ideas from Byzantine architecture encountered on eastern trade routes, creating vertical mazes that exhausted attackers long before they reached anything vital. Saxon military thinking struggled to adapt. Their traditional tactics assumed predictable defensive layouts, weak points that could be exploited, and fortifications that stayed the same throughout a siege. The Viking fortresses changed constantly, adapted continuously, and presented new challenges every day of an extended siege. By 900, the 5 boroughs had become something nobody had anticipated, the foundation of a new kind of state. Not a traditional kingdom ruled by divine right, but a federation of fortress cities governed by assemblies, sustained by trade, and defended by populations that had every reason to fight for their homes. The irony is beautiful when you think about it. The Vikings had come to England as raiders, planning to take what they could and leave. Instead, they'd created something so successful, so prosperous, and so defensible that they never wanted to leave. The fortresses that were supposed to be temporary military camps had become the seeds of a civilization, and that's when Saxon resistance got serious. Because if the Vikings were going to stay, if they were going to build fortress empires in the heart of England, then the Saxons were going to have to learn their game and play it better. The student was about to challenge the teacher, and the results would reshape medieval warfare forever. 917 after Christ. That's the year everything changed. That's when Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, unveiled the Saxon, a response to Viking fortress dominance, HAT, and it was magnificent. For 50 years, Saxon warriors had watched helplessly as Viking strongholds sprouted across their homeland like mushrooms after rain. They'd studied these fortifications, died attacking them, and slowly, very slowly, begun to understand what made them work. But understanding and implementing are two completely different challenges. Edward had spent years doing something that would make modern intelligence analysts proud. He'd systematically studied every captured Viking fortification, learning their secrets from the one source Vikings couldn't control, Saxon craftsmen who'd been forced to build for Norse masters. And now it was payback time. The Saxon burr-building program that Edward unleashed was massive, coordinated, and brilliant. But here's what made it revolutionary. Edward didn't just copy Viking designs, he improved them. His new fortresses incorporated every Viking innovation but added distinctly Saxon improvements. Stone foundations that prevented the undermining techniques Vikings had perfected. Double walls creating killing fields between them, where attackers would be trapped and slaughtered. Permanent garrisons, funded by innovative tax systems that turned fortress defense into a sustainable economic model. The first test came at Tempsford, and it was beautiful in its irony. Vikings had built Tempsford as an impregnable stronghold, using all their accumulated wisdom about defensive architecture. Circular walls, integrated living spaces, sophisticated water management, everything that had made Saxon attacks fail for decades. But in 921, Edward's forces surrounded that Viking fortress with their own instant fortifications. The besiegers became the besieged. Prince Ethelred led the Saxon forces, and what he unleashed would have made his Viking enemies proud. Modular siege towers assembled from pre-cut timbers, sevdobt, the same prefabrication techniques Vikings had pioneered. Log pathways that allowed these towers to roll forward smoothly. When Viking defenders responded with their traditional burning oil attacks, Saxon engineers were ready with water-soaked hide coverings. They'd learned every lesson, every technique, every innovation. But the psychological warfare was perhaps the most devastating reversal of all. Saxons began using Viking methods against their creators, intimidating siege towers decorated with dragon heads, the same symbols that had terrified Saxon populations for generations. Horn calls that mimicked Norse battle cries, turning familiar sounds into sources of dread for Viking defenders. The patient siege tactics that had once broken Saxon resolve were now being applied with Saxon determination. Inside Tempsford, Viking defenders faced a horrible realization. The fortress designs that had made them feel invincible could trap just as effectively as they protected. Those circular walls that eliminated escape routes for attackers also eliminated escape routes for defenders. The same water systems that sustained them during siege could be poisoned by determined besiegers. The modular construction that allowed rapid repairs also created structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited by engineers who understood the building techniques. The decade that followed saw fortress warfare pushed to heights that wouldn't be matched until the gunpowder age. Both sides were innovating frantically, each advance triggering counter-innovations in an arms race that produced marvels of medieval engineering. Viking builders responded with even more sophisticated designs, fortresses with false walls that created trap corridors, where attackers would find themselves surrounded after thinking they'd achieved a breakthrough. Tower designs inspired by Byzantine architecture encountered on eastern trade routes, EZC, imagined defensive structures incorporating ideas from Constantinople's legendary walls. The acoustic engineering reached new heights, with sound systems that could prevent defenders from sleeping, psychological weapons that attacked the mind as effectively as catapults attacked walls. Saxon engineers weren't content to merely copy anymore. They developed specialized siege equipment designed specifically to counter Viking innovations. Drilling machines that could penetrate the hardest oak timbers, catapults designed specifically to clear Viking wall walks of defenders. Mobile shields that protected sappers as they undermined foundations using techniques learned from captured Viking engineers. By 930, fortress warfare had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to warriors from just a generation earlier. Both sides were employing Greek fire techniques acquired from Byzantine traders, sophisticated counter-mining operations where tunnelers fought underground battles while surface sieges continued above. Sound warfare where armies tried to drive each other mad with constant noise. The siege of Malden in 932 demonstrated just how far the art had evolved. Saxon forces used coordinated attacks from multiple directions while simultaneously conducting underground operations. Viking defenders responded with collapsible bridge systems that turned their fortress into multiple independent strongholds. When Saxons broke through the outer defenses, they found themselves facing inner fortifications that were actually stronger than what they'd already overcome. The battle lasted 6 months and involved innovations that wouldn't look out of place in later medieval conflicts. Siege engines that could be rapidly assembled and disassembled. Defensive systems that could be reconfigured overnight. Engineering solutions that incorporated metallurgy, carpentry, and tactical psychology. But here's what's really remarkable about this period. The innovations were flowing in both directions. Viking fortress builders were learning from Saxon and adaptations, while Saxon engineers continued studying every Viking technique they could observe. Captured warriors from both sides were interrogated not just for tactical intelligence but for engineering knowledge. The result was a fusion of building techniques that combined Norse flexibility with Saxon permanence, Viking innovation with English systematization. By 940, you couldn't really distinguish between a Viking fortress and a Saxon fortress anymore. The techniques had merged into something new, early medieval military architecture that would influence European defensive design for centuries. The human cost was enormous, but so was the intellectual achievement. These weren't just soldiers throwing themselves at walls anymore. They were engineers, architects, and tactical innovators pushing the boundaries of what was possible with wood, stone, and iron. They were creating military science. And that's when something unexpected happened. The students, both Saxon and Viking, were about to surpass their teachers, because the next generation of fortress builders would take these wooden innovations and translate them into something permanent, something that would define European civilization for the next 1,000 years. The age of stone castles was about to begin, and everything they'd learned from wooden fortresses would live on in limestone and granite forever. 950 after Christ marked the beginning of an extraordinary transformation. Those innovative wooden Viking fortresses that had revolutionized British warfare were about to evolve into something permanent, the stone castles that would define medieval Europe for the next 1,000 years. At Dover, Norman observers were conducting what we'd recognize today as military intelligence gathering. They walked through the remains of Viking fortifications, sketching, measuring, and recognizing that these designs surpassed anything in contemporary French military architecture. The circular layouts that eliminated weak corners, the integrated living and defensive spaces, the sophisticated water management systems, 12. All of it was being carefully documented and analyzed. When William the Conqueror's master builders began designing what we now call motte and bailey castles, they weren't creating something entirely new. They were translating Viking ring fortresses into earth and stone. Those iconic Norman castles that dotted the English landscape? They were essentially Viking fortresses reimagined in permanent materials. The Tower of London itself, INC, that ultimate symbol of Norman power, incorporated Viking innovations throughout its design. The White Tower's curved walls that deflected siege engines, its multiple defensive levels that exhausted attackers, its integrated garrison quarters where soldiers lived alongside their defenses, 283. All of these features traced their ancestry directly back to wooden fortresses that had amazed Saxon warriors a century earlier. But here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. Modern archaeological excavations in the 1980s uncovered evidence of just how sophisticated Viking fortress engineering really was. At Trelleborg in Denmark, researchers discovered mathematical precision that rivaled Roman engineering. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about fortresses laid out using complex geometry, with streets aligned to astronomical observations and buildings positioned according to sophisticated planning principles that wouldn't look out of place in a modern city design. These weren't random settlements thrown up by barbaric raiders. These were planned communities designed by engineers who understood mathematics, astronomy, and human psychology. Ground-penetrating radar revealed elaborate drainage systems that maintained proper sanitation for thousands of inhabitants. Underground storage chambers that maintained constant cool temperatures for food preservation. foundation techniques that prevented settling even in marshy ground where traditional construction would have failed within years. Military engineers studying these sites in the 21st century have discovered principles that remain relevant to contemporary defense. The use of multiple defensive rings, creating overlapping fields of fire, the psychological impact of imposing entrances designed to intimidate attackers before they even reached the walls, the integration of natural obstacles into defensive plans that turned geography itself into a weapon. But the deepest legacy isn't visible in any archaeological site. It lives in the landscape of modern Britain itself. Walk through any town in northern England, and you're walking through Viking fortress logic. Those English place names ending in Thorpe, by, and Thwaite mark locations where Viking fortresses once stood. The street layouts that seem to curve for no apparent reason, they're following circular patterns established by Norse builders 1,000 years ago. The very concept of the castle, ATA, a fortified residence combining military and domestic functions, ESE, emerged directly from Viking fortresses where jarls lived among their warriors. Before Viking influence, European defensive architecture separated military and civilian functions. Fortresses were for fighting, halls were for living, and never the twain shall meet. The Vikings changed that forever. They created the idea of the fortified home, the defensive residence, the castle as we understand it. Every medieval fortress from Scotland to Sicily owes something to innovations pioneered in wooden Viking strongholds. Modern urban planning unconsciously follows principles that Viking fortress builders pioneered: mixed-use development where people live, work, and defend the same space. Defensive architecture that doesn't sacrifice livability for security. Community spaces that foster social cohesion while maintaining military effectiveness. When you drive through a modern city with its planned districts, integrated infrastructure, and multiple transportation networks, you're seeing concepts that trace back to Viking fortress planners, who understood that successful communities needed to function as both homes and strongholds. The archaeological evidence keeps revealing new layers of sophistication. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of standardized building components, ES, essentially medieval mass production that allowed rapid fortress construction, watermills that provided power for both grain processing and weapon manufacturing, workshop districts specialized in different crafts but integrated into the overall defensive scheme. These weren't just military installations. They were complete societies, planned cities, integrated communities that happened to be surrounded by formidable defenses. The Vikings had essentially invented the fortified city-state and made it work on British soil. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery is how these communities managed resources. Detailed analysis of refuse pits reveals sophisticated recycling systems, planned agriculture that maximized nutrition while minimizing land use, and trade networks that connected individual fortresses to markets spanning from Greenland to Constantinople. The Viking fortress builders had created something unprecedented: sustainable military communities that grew stronger over time instead of exhausting their resources. They'd solved the fundamental problem of medieval warfare, AUT, how to maintain a military force without destroying the economy that supported it. And here's the final irony that brings this whole story full circle. When Saxon warriors first witnessed Viking fortresses outside York in 865, they couldn't believe that wooden walls could withstand their assault. They were right to be amazed, but not for the reasons they thought. They weren't just seeing better engineering or superior building techniques. They were witnessing the birth of defensive architecture that would shape European civilization for the next millennium. Those impossible wooden walls that bent instead of breaking, those circular designs that eliminated weak points, those integrated communities that combined military effectiveness with domestic comfort, all of it, would live on in stone and mortar long after the last Viking fortress had rotted away. Every time you see a medieval castle, every time you walk through a historic European city, every time you encounter military architecture that prioritizes both defense and livability, you're seeing the legacy of Viking fortress builders who revolutionized warfare by revolutionizing the very concept of what a fortress could be. The wooden walls are gone, but the genius that created them lives on in limestone and granite, in city planning and military theory, in the fundamental understanding that the strongest defenses are those that protect not just soldiers, but entire ways of life. That's the true legacy of the Viking fortress builders. TA. They didn't just change how wars were fought, they changed how civilizations were built.